I'm excited to welcome you to my channel. Before I dive into my story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when our usual fishing crew gathered around the campfire at the edge of Lake Miller. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a golden hue over the water, while the smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air. As we sat on our worn folding chairs, each of us with a fishing rod leaning against a nearby tree, the conversation naturally turned to gear. It was the same debate that had been simmering for years. Does high-end fishing equipment really make that much of a difference? Or can a skilled angler do just as well with a budget setup? We all had our opinions. Mike, always the gearhead, argued that premium rods, reels, and lures offered unparalleled precision, sensitivity, and durability. He swore by his $500 setup, convinced that it gave him an undeniable edge on the water. "You get what you pay for," he'd say with a confident grin, reeling off stories of how his high-end gear had helped him land fish that others might have missed. To Mike, spending more on quality gear was an investment in better results. On the other side of the debate was Tom, the old-timer of the group, who believed that good fishing came down to skill, experience, and a bit of luck. Tom was the kind of guy who could pull a fish out of a puddle if he had to. He'd been fishing with the same beat-up rod for years, a relic from the days when fancy gear wasn't an option. "It's the angler, not the equipment," he'd say, his voice gruff but warm. Tom's catches were as impressive as anyone's, proving that he didn't need expensive gear to get the job done. I found myself somewhere in the middle. I appreciated the craftsmanship of high-end equipment, but I'd also seen plenty of fish caught on gear that didn't cost an arm and a leg. The idea that someone with a basic setup could outperform someone with all the bells and whistles intrigued me. I'd always wondered, was the price tag really worth it? Could a $50 setup hold its own against a $500 rig? That's when an idea hit me. Why not put it to the test? What if we made a challenge out of it? I suggested, my voice cutting through the friendly banter. The group quieted, turning to look at me with curiosity. A budget fishing challenge. One person uses a $50 setup, the other uses a $500 setup, and we see who catches the most fish. Mike's eyes lit up with interest. "You're on," he said without hesitation. "I'll take the $500 setup, and we'll see who really knows how to fish." Tom chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "I like the sound of that," he said. Mike finally settled this debate. The excitement in the group was palpable as we hashed out the details. We decided that the challenge would take place the following weekend at Lake Miller, a spot we all knew well. It was a fair location, with a healthy mix of bass, crappie, and bluegill, and plenty of structure to fish around. We agreed to keep the rules simple. Both anglers would fish the same lake at the same time, with a 4-hour window to catch as much as they could. The winner would be determined by the total weight of their catches. As we talked strategy, I felt a rush of adrenaline. I'd volunteered to take on the $50 challenge, eager to see how well I could do with a budget setup. The thought of going head-to-head with Mike and his high-end gear was both daunting and exhilarating. I knew I'd have to rely on every bit of skill, experience, and knowledge I'd gained over the years. This wasn't just about proving a point, it was about testing myself as an angler. Mike, for his part, was brimming with confidence. He'd already started mentally assembling his gear, a custom rod with a carbon fiber blank, a premium reel with a smooth drag system, and a collection of high-end lures designed to target every species in the lake. "This is going to be fun," he said, his grin wide. "But don't say I didn't warn you when my gear outperforms yours." I laughed, but the truth was, I knew I had my work cut out for me. My $50 budget would barely cover a basic rod and reel, let alone the specialized lures and tackle that Mike would be using. But that was the point of the challenge, after all, to see if an angler's skill could bridge the gap between budget and premium gear. As the fire crackled and the sky darkened, we finalized the plan. Tom agreed to be our judge, weighing our catches at the end of the day and declaring the winner. The rest of the group was excited to watch the competition unfold, some even placing friendly bets on who would come out on top. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a sense of anticipation and camaraderie that only comes from a shared love of fishing. That night, as I packed up my gear and headed home, I couldn't stop thinking about the upcoming challenge. My mind raced with strategies, trying to figure out how to maximize my chances with a budget setup. I knew I'd have to be smart about my choices, selecting versatile gear that could handle different conditions and species. More than that, I knew I'd have to fish with precision and patience, making every cast count. The $50 versus $500 fishing challenge was set, and there was no turning back. I had a week to prepare, and I intended to make the most of it. This was my chance to prove that great fishing wasn't just about the gear, it was about the angler. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, visions of the lake and the fish I'd soon be chasing filled my dreams. The countdown had begun, and I was ready for whatever the water had in store. With the challenge set, the pressure was on to choose the right gear. For Mike, the $500 budget was a luxury that allowed him to pick and choose from top-of-the-line equipment. He approached the task with the confidence of someone who had been fishing with high-end gear for years, knowing exactly what he needed to maximize his chances of success. Mike started by selecting his rod and reel combo, the backbone of any fishing setup. He opted for a custom-built baitcasting rod with a carbon fiber blank, known for its lightweight strength and sensitivity. The rod was a medium-heavy power with a fast action, perfect for detecting even the faintest of bites and setting the hook quickly. This setup would allow him to fish a variety of lures with precision, whether he was working a crankbait along the bottom or casting a topwater lure near the surface. The carbon fiber construction ensured that the rod was not only strong but also responsive, giving Mike the edge he needed to feel every subtle movement. Paired with the rod was a high-end baitcasting reel, one with a silky smooth drag system and a high gear ratio that would enable quick retrieves, ideal for when he needed to get a lure back in quickly to recast or when fighting a fast-moving fish. The reel featured advanced braking systems that minimized backlashes and allowed for longer, more accurate casts. With its ergonomic design and lightweight frame, the reel fit perfectly in Mike's hand, giving him complete control over his casts and retrieves. Next, Mike turned his attention to the line. He chose a premium braided line, opting for its superior strength, low stretch, and thin diameter. Braided line is known for its sensitivity, which would allow Mike to feel even the slightest taps from fish. This would be especially useful when fishing deep water or heavy cover, where a sensitive line could mean the difference between feeling a bite and missing it altogether. The thin diameter of the braid also meant he could spool more line onto the reel, giving him the ability to make long casts and reach fish that were holding far from the boat. With the core of his setup chosen, Mike moved on to selecting his lures. His $500 budget gave him the freedom to be selective, and he filled his tackle box with an array of high-quality options. He picked out a few crankbaits in different colors and diving depths, designed to target bass at various levels in the water column. He also selected jigs for working the bottom structure and soft plastic worms that could be rigged in multiple ways to adapt to changing conditions. For topwater action, Mike added a couple of poppers and walking baits, perfect for enticing strikes from aggressive fish in the shallows. Each lure was carefully chosen based on its proven effectiveness in the lake we'd be fishing. Mike knew that having a variety of lures at his disposal would allow him to adapt to the conditions as they changed throughout the day. Whether the fish were feeding near the surface, suspended in deeper water, or holding tight to cover, Mike had the right tool for the job. As he assembled his gear, Mike couldn't help but feel a surge of confidence. His setup was a well-oiled machine, each component working in harmony to give him the best possible chance of success. He knew that his investment in high-end equipment would pay off, allowing him to fish with precision, sensitivity, and control. With his gear ready, Mike was eager to hit the water and show what top-tier equipment could do. Meanwhile, I faced a very different challenge. With only $50 to spend, I had to be strategic, making every dollar count. My goal was to find a setup that was versatile, reliable, and capable of handling whatever the lake threw at me, even if it didn't have the bells and whistles of Mike's gear. I started by searching online for deals, visiting local tackle shops, and even checking out discount stores in hopes of finding hidden gems. After some careful research and a bit of luck, I found a spinning rod and reel combo that fit my budget. It wasn't anything fancy, a 6 feet 6 inches medium power rod paired with a simple reel pre-spooled with monofilament line, but it was sturdy and versatile. The rod's medium power meant it was strong enough to handle larger fish, while still being sensitive enough for finesse techniques. The monofilament line was a practical choice, less sensitive than braid, but more forgiving, and well-suited to a variety of lures and conditions. With the core of my setup secured, I turned to the tackle. My budget allowed for only a few select items, so I had to choose carefully. I picked up a small pack of plastic worms, knowing that their versatility would be key in targeting base around structure. I also grabbed a spinnerbait, a reliable choice for covering water and enticing reaction strikes from fish that might be hiding in the weeds or under lily pads. A few jig heads completed the essentials, allowing me to rig the worms in different ways depending on the conditions. As I shopped, I focused on versatility. Every piece of gear had to serve multiple purposes, as I couldn't afford to bring a wide variety of specialized lures. I knew I would need to be creative, using the same lures in different ways to adapt to the fish's behavior. The plastic worms, for instance, could be rigged Texas-style for fishing through heavy cover or wacky-rigged for a slower, more erratic presentation. Finally, I picked up a few basic accessories, hooks, sinkers, and a couple of bobbers. These were inexpensive but essential, allowing me to adjust my presentation as needed. With my $50 spent, I packed up my gear and prepared for the challenge ahead. As I laid out my setup next to Mike's the night before the challenge, the contrast was stark. His gear was sleek, polished, and built for performance, while mine was simple, functional, and unassuming. But I felt a sense of pride in what I'd assembled. I knew that while my gear might not have the same level of refinement, it was reliable, and with the right technique, I could still be competitive. The night before the challenge, I reviewed my plan. I knew that I'd need to rely on my knowledge of the lake and my ability to adapt to the conditions. The gear I had chosen was versatile, allowing me to fish in different ways depending on what the day brought. I felt ready, knowing that while I was up against a formidable opponent with superior gear, I had the skills and experience to make my budget setup work. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nerves. The challenge was more than just a competition, it was an opportunity to test myself, to see if I could rise to the occasion and prove that great fishing isn't just about the gear, but about the angler. I knew that the day ahead would be tough, but I was ready to give it everything I had. The morning of the challenge dawned crisp and clear, the kind of early autumn day that anglers dream of. As I pulled into the parking lot at Lake Miller, the first light of dawn was just starting to break over the horizon, casting a soft pink glow across the water. The lake was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the trees that lined the shore, their leaves beginning to turn shades of red and gold. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth, a reminder that summer had given way to fall. The atmosphere was serene, but there was an undercurrent of excitement as I prepared for the day ahead. Mike was already at the boat ramp when I arrived, his high-end gear neatly arranged beside his truck. Even in the dim light of dawn, his setup looked impressive, sleek, polished, and ready for action. He greeted me with a nod and a grin, clearly confident in his choice of equipment. His bait-casting rod, with its carbon fiber blank, gleamed in the early morning light, and his tackle box was open, revealing a selection of premium lures, each one meticulously organized. "Ready to get started?" Mike asked, his tone casual but with an edge of competitiveness. "Absolutely," I replied, feeling a surge of determination as I unloaded my own gear. My $50 setup was a stark contrast to Mike's, a basic spinning rod and reel, a small tackle box with just a few lures, and the essential accessories I'd managed to squeeze into my budget. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine, and I was ready to put it to the test. As we prepped our gear, we exchanged a few lighthearted jabs, both of us aware that the real competition was about to begin. I checked my rod and reel, making sure the line was secure and the drag was set just right. The reel wasn't as smooth as Mike's, but it turned steadily enough. The monofilament line, already spooled, was a bit thicker than I would have liked, but it would have to do. I tied on a plastic worm to start, knowing it was a versatile choice that could be fished slowly along the bottom or work near the surface if needed. Mike, on the other hand, was busy fine-tuning his setup, adjusting the tension on his baitcaster and selecting the first lure of the day, a deep-diving crankbait with a realistic shed pattern, perfect for targeting bass in the deeper sections of the lake. His movements were precise and practiced, the result of years spent honing his craft with high-end gear. Tom, our unofficial judge for the day, arrived a few minutes later. He watched us with a knowing smile, clearly enjoying the friendly rivalry that had sprung up between us. "All right, boys," he said, his voice carrying over the stillness of the morning. "You've got 4 hours to fish. Remember, it's not just about quantity, it's about weight. The one with the heaviest total catch wins." We both nodded, understanding the rules. It wasn't just about catching the most fish, it was about catching the right fish. The challenge would require us to be strategic, to choose our spots carefully, and to make every cast count. With everything ready, we shook hands, wished each other luck, and headed to our chosen spots. Mike paddled confidently toward the deeper water near the center of the lake, where he hoped to find schools of bass suspended near submerged structures. His high-end gear would allow him to cast far and deep, reaching fish that might be holding at depths that my setup couldn't easily access. I, on the other hand, had decided to start in a shallow cove on the north side of the lake, an area I knew well from previous trips. The cove was filled with submerged logs, patches of lily pads, and overhanging trees, perfect cover for bass in the early morning hours. My strategy was simple: focus on areas where fish were likely to be feeding and use my plastic worms and spinnerbaits to work the structure thoroughly. As I paddled into the cove, the quiet of the morning wrapped around me like a blanket. The only sounds were the soft splash of my paddle and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. The water here was calm, undisturbed, and I could see the shadows of fish darting beneath the surface. The air was crisp, with just a hint of moisture, a reminder of the cool night that had just passed. It was a perfect day for fishing, and despite the competitive aspect of the challenge, I felt a deep sense of peace and contentment as I prepared to make my first cast. I anchored my kayak near a large fallen log, one end of which extended into deeper water. It was the kind of spot that always looked promising, where the change in depth created a natural ambush point for bass. I cast my plastic worm toward the base of the log, letting it sink slowly to the bottom. The first few casts were tentative, more about getting a feel for the rod and reel than anything else. The gear felt basic in my hands, the rod less sensitive than I was used to, the reel a bit clunky, but it was functional. I focused on making accurate casts, placing the worm as close to the structure as possible and working it back with slow, deliberate twitches. Meanwhile, across the lake, Mike was settling into his own rhythm. He started by casting his crankbait toward a submerged rock pile, using the baitcaster's smooth operation to reach deep into the water. The sensitivity of his rod allowed him to feel every contour of the bottom, and the braided line transmitted even the faintest of taps from fish inspecting his lure. The crankbait's lifelike action and realistic pattern made it an enticing target, and Mike knew that if there were fish holding near the rocks, they wouldn't be able to resist. Back in the cove, I was focused on working the structure, trying to make the most of my budget setup. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the water, and the fish were active, feeding in the cooler temperatures of the early morning. I cast toward the edge of a lily pad patch, the plastic worm landing softly on the water's surface before sinking slowly into the depths. I worked the lure with gentle twitches, trying to mimic the movement of a real worm. It didn't take long before I felt the first bite, a subtle tap that sent a thrill of excitement through me. I paused for a moment, letting the fish take the bait, then set the hook with a quick, firm motion. The rod bent under the weight, and I felt the fish on the other end, fighting with surprising strength. My heart raced as I began to reel in, feeling the tension in the line as the fish made a run toward the cover of the logs. The fight was on, and I could feel every movement of the fish transmitted through the rod. The gear was basic, but it was holding up well under the strain. I carefully played the fish, giving it just enough line to tire itself out before slowly reeling it in. The kayak rocked slightly with the struggle, but I adjusted my position and kept the rod tip high, guiding the fish toward the boat. When I finally brought the fish to the surface, I saw it was a chunky largemouth bass, not a giant but a solid catch. I carefully lifted it into the kayak, feeling a surge of satisfaction as I unhooked it and admired its size. The first fish of the day had been landed, and my confidence grew. The $50 setup might not have the finesse of Mike's gear, but it was doing the job. As I released the base back into the water, I couldn't help but smile. The competition was just getting started, but I was off to a good start. The morning was young, and there were plenty more fish to catch. I knew I had to make the most of this early success, so I quickly re-rigged my worm and cast again, ready to see what else the lake had in store. On the other side of the lake, Mike was also finding success. He had landed a solid bass of his own, the crankbait proving to be an effective choice for targeting fish in deeper water. The high-end gear was giving him the sensitivity and control he needed to detect bites and fight fish with precision. But he knew that this was just the beginning, and he remained focused on his strategy, determined to make every cast count. The hours ticked by as both Mike and I settled into the rhythm of the challenge. The lake remained calm, the early morning mist slowly burning off as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The competition was shaping up to be a close one, with both of us landing fish and adapting to the changing conditions as the day progressed. The challenge had officially begun, and with it came the thrill of competition, the joy of being on the water, and the satisfaction of testing our skills against each other. As the clock continued to count down, I knew that the real challenge was still ahead. The fish would become more selective as the sun rose, and I'd need to adapt my approach if I wanted to stay competitive. But for now, I was content to savor the moment, knowing that no matter what happened, I was doing what I loved, fishing on a beautiful lake, testing my limits, and enjoying the camaraderie that comes with a shared passion. As the sun climbed higher, the morning air warmed, and the mist that had earlier clung to the lake surface began to dissipate. The early hours of the challenge had been fruitful, but as the light intensified, I knew the conditions would change, and so would the behavior of the fish. The challenge was now shifting into a new phase, one that required patience, adaptation, and keen observation. I was still working the shallow cove on the north side of the lake, a spot I'd chosen for its combination of structure and cover. The cove was rich with submerged logs, clusters of lily pads, and the overhanging branches of willow trees that dipped into the water, creating a perfect environment for bass. It was a place where fish could hide from predators, find food, and ambush unsuspecting prey, a bass angler's dream. The first few catches had come relatively quickly, thanks to the cooler morning temperatures that had kept the fish active and feeding near the surface. But as the sun continued its ascent, I noticed the activity in the cove beginning to slow. The once lively surface was now calm, the occasional ripple from a jumping fish becoming increasingly rare. The shadows that had provided cover were shrinking, and I knew the bass would soon start moving to deeper, cooler water or hunker down in the thickest cover. The plastic worm I had been using was still tied to the end of my line, and it had proven to be an effective choice in the early hours. I had rigged it Texas style, allowing me to work it through the heavy cover without snagging. The slow, methodical presentations had tempted several bass into biting, but now I needed to rethink my strategy. I decided to stick with the plastic worm for a bit longer but adjusted my approach to target the edges of deeper water, where I suspected the bass might be moving as the temperatures rose. I cast toward a submerged log that extended from the shallows into deeper water, letting the worm sink slowly before giving it a few gentle twitches. The key was to make the lure look like an easy meal, something the bass couldn't resist even if they were beginning to grow sluggish. The lack of sensitivity in my rod made it difficult to feel every nuance of the lure's movement, so I relied heavily on visual cues, watching the line for any signs of a bite, even the slightest twitch or pause. It required a level of focus and patience that tested my skills, but I was determined to make it work. After several casts with no bites, I decided to switch tactics. I picked up the spinnerbait I had brought, a lure that could cover more water and provoke reaction strikes from bass that might not be actively feeding. The spinnerbait's flashing blades and erratic movement through the water were designed to mimic the erratic swimming of a fleeing baitfish, a tempting target for any predator. I began casting it toward the edges of the lily pads, where I knew bass might be lurking, waiting to ambush anything that strayed too close. The first few casts yielded nothing, but I kept at it, methodically working the edges of the cover. On one cast, as I retrieved the spinnerbait past a clump of lily pads, I felt a sudden jolt, the unmistakable strike of a bass hitting hard. The rod bent sharply as the fish tried to escape back into the cover. My heart raced as I set the hook and began the fight. The bass put up a strong resistance, pulling hard against the line, but I managed to keep it out of the thick vegetation. The rod and reel were basic, but they held up under the pressure, and after a short but intense battle, I brought the fish to the surface. It was a solid largemouth, not the biggest of the day, but a respectable catch nonetheless. I carefully unhooked the fish and released it back into the water, watching as it swam away with a powerful flick of its tail. That catch reinvigorated me, reminding me that even with a budget setup, I could still land quality fish. But I also knew that I couldn't rely on the spinnerbait alone. As the day warmed, the bass would likely become more selective, and I would need to switch back to slower, more deliberate presentations. I alternated between the spinnerbait and the plastic worm, working different parts of the cove, trying to stay one step ahead of the fish. Meanwhile, across the lake, Mike was navigating the deeper waters, using his high-end gear to target bass that were holding near submerged structures and drop-offs. He had switched to a jig and peg combo, a classic setup for fishing deep structure. The sensitivity of his rod allowed him to feel the jig as it bounced along the bottom, detecting even the faintest of taps from fish. The braided line transmitted every vibration, giving Mike the feedback he needed to adjust his retrieval speed and lure presentation. Despite his superior gear, Mike was finding the fishing tougher than expected. The fish in the deeper water were more cautious, likely holding tight to cover and not willing to chase lures. He had to be patient, working the jig slowly, letting it sink into the crevices between rocks and logs where bass might be hiding. His high-end equipment gave him an advantage in these conditions, but it also required a high level of precision and concentration. Mike managed to hook into a couple of solid bass, but each catch was hard-won, requiring careful attention to detail and a methodical approach. The deeper water was less forgiving, and any mistakes in presentation could mean the difference between a strike and a missed opportunity. Mike knew that the key to success was persistence. If he kept his lure in the strike zone long enough, the bass would eventually bite. As the morning wore on, both of us were deep in the challenge, adapting to the changing conditions and the behavior of the fish. I had moved to the far side of the cove, where a stand of cattails created a natural funnel, leading into a deeper pocket of water. It was the perfect spot for bass to ambush prey, and I suspected that a few might be hiding there, waiting for an easy meal. I switched back to the plastic worm, casting it just beyond the cattails and letting it sink slowly. I worked the lure with small, subtle movements, trying to mimic the natural motion of a worm crawling along the bottom. It was a technique that required patience, as the bites were often light and easy to miss. I kept my eyes on the line, watching for any telltale signs of a bite. After several casts, I felt a slight tug, a soft tap that was almost imperceptible. I paused, letting the fish take the worm, then set the hook with a quick snap of the wrist. The rod bent sharply, and I felt the weight of a good-sized bass on the other end. The fish made a strong run, pulling hard toward the cover of the cattails, but I managed to steer it away, using the rod to apply pressure and guide it into open water. The fight was intense, the bass pulling with surprising strength for its size. I could feel the strain on the rod and reel, but they held up, allowing me to keep control of the situation. The kayak rocked slightly with the struggle, but I maintained my balance, reeling in steadily as the fish tired. When I finally brought it to the surface, I saw that it was a solid bass, one that would add significant weight to my total catch. I carefully unhooked the fish and placed it in the live well, feeling a sense of satisfaction as I did. The day was progressing well, and I had managed to land several quality fish, despite the limitations of my gear. The challenge was still anyone's game, but I knew I was holding my own. The morning continued with both Mike and I working hard to outfish each other. The competition was fierce, but there was also a mutual respect for the effort and skill each of us was bringing to the table. The lake, now fully illuminated by the midday sun, had taken on a different character. The early morning quiet had given way to a lively scene, with fish occasionally breaking the surface and birds diving for their own catches. As the clock continued to count down, I knew that the challenge was entering its final stages. The fish were becoming more selective, the bites less frequent, and the need for precise, thoughtful fishing had never been greater. I had found success with my basic setup, but I knew that I couldn't afford to become complacent. Every cast, every decision mattered now, and I was determined to make the most of the time I had left. The challenge had proven to be as much about adaptation and strategy as it was about the gear we were using. While Mike's high-end setup had given him certain advantages, my budget rig had held its own, allowing me to land fish and stay competitive. The real question was whether I could keep up the momentum as the conditions continued to change. The answer would come soon enough, as we headed into the final stretch of the challenge. As the morning wore on and the sun reached its zenith, the calm waters of Lake Miller began to glisten under the intense midday light. The early morning bite had tapered off, and both Mike and I knew we were entering the most challenging part of the day. The fish, having fed actively in the cooler hours, were now more lethargic, retreating to deeper, cooler waters or hunkering down in the thickest cover. This was the time when every decision mattered, the time when experience, patience, and adaptability would be put to the test. I had already caught a few solid fish, and my $50 setup had performed admirably, but now, as the bite slowed, I found myself facing a new kind of challenge. The limitations of my budget gear were becoming more apparent. The rod, while serviceable, lacked the sensitivity needed to detect the subtle bites of fish that were no longer feeding aggressively. The reel, too, was beginning to show signs of strain, the drag system not as smooth as I would have liked when dealing with stronger fish. Yet, despite these challenges, I remained determined to make the most of what I had. The key, I knew, was to focus on technique and presentation. The plastic worm had been effective earlier in the day, but now I needed to slow down even more, giving the fish plenty of time to inspect the lure before committing to a bite. I switched back to a Texas-rigged worm, casting it toward the base of submerged logs and along the edges of weed beds, where I suspected the base might be hiding. The slower, more deliberate presentation required intense concentration, as I had to rely more on visual cues and the slight tension in the line than on the feel of the rod. I cast toward a thick patch of lily pads, letting the worm sink slowly into the shadows. As I worked the lure back, I felt a slight resistance, just a faint tug, almost imperceptible. My instincts told me it was a bite, but without the sensitivity of a higher-end rod, I couldn't be sure. I paused, giving the fish time to fully take the bait, then set the hook with a sharp snap of my wrist. The rod bent under the strain, and I felt the weight of a fish on the other end. The fish immediately dove for the cover of the lily pads, and I could feel the drag system of the reel struggling to keep up. The fish was strong, pulling hard and using the thick vegetation to its advantage. I knew that if it managed to wrap the line around the stems of the lily pads, I could lose it. I applied steady pressure, keeping the rod tip high and trying to steer the fish away from the cover. The fight was intense, the fish putting up a serious struggle as it thrashed and pulled against the line. My heart pounded as I carefully worked to bring it in, the kayak rocking slightly with the movement. I could feel the strain on the rod and reel, both of which were pushed to their limits. The reel's drag was less than smooth, forcing me to be extra careful with how much pressure I applied. It was a delicate balance, too little pressure, and the fish could dive back into the cover, too much, and I risked breaking the line or losing the fish altogether. After what felt like an eternity, I finally managed to guide the fish out of the weeds and into open water. From there, it was a matter of keeping the tension steady and waiting for the fish to tire. When it finally surfaced, I could see that it was another solid largemouth bass, its dark green body glistening in the sunlight. It wasn't the biggest fish of the day, but it was a hard-won catch, one that had tested both my gear and my resolve. As I carefully lifted the fish into the kayak and unhooked it, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was the kind of challenge I had anticipated when I agreed to take on the $50 setup. It wasn't just about catching fish, it was about overcoming the limitations of my gear through skill, patience, and determination. The bass might not have been the largest of the day, but it represented a small victory, a testament to the idea that great fishing isn't just about the equipment. While I was battling with my own challenges, Mike was dealing with his own set of difficulties on the other side of the lake. His high-end setup, while giving him significant advantages in terms of sensitivity and control, wasn't immune to the midday lull. The deeper water he was targeting required patience and precision, as the bass were no longer as eager to chase down lures. Mike had switched to a drop-shot rig, a finesse technique that allowed him to present a soft plastic bait just off the bottom, keeping it in the strike zone for longer periods of time. The drop-shot rig, combined with his sensitive rod and braided line, allowed Mike to feel every movement of the bait and detect even the lightest taps from the fish. But the challenge was maintaining focus and discipline. The slow pace of the fishing meant that every cast had to be perfect, every retrieve deliberate. Mike knew that even with the best gear, it was still up to him to make the most of it. Despite the premium equipment, Mike found himself in a struggle for balance as well. The high-end rod transmitted even the smallest vibrations, but that also meant that he could feel every snag, every piece of debris on the bottom. It was easy to become overly cautious, second-guessing every movement and potentially missing opportunities. Yet, when the fish did bite, the sensitivity of his setup allowed him to react instantly, setting the hook with precision and keeping the fish on the line. Mike landed a couple of quality bass using the drop-shot rig, each one a testament to the effectiveness of his gear and technique. But even with these successes, he knew that the challenge was far from over. The weight of the fish mattered, and both of us were aware that a single large catch could tip the scales in our favor. As the midday sun blazed down, I moved to a new spot, a shaded area under a large willow tree that extended out over the water. The shade provided some relief from the heat and offered a cooler environment where fish might be holding. I cast the worm into the shadows, letting it sink slowly before beginning a slow, steady retrieve. The minutes ticked by in silence, each cast a test of patience and persistence. The lake was calm, the surface now glassy in the stillness of the afternoon. It was a stark contrast to the active morning, and I had to remind myself to stay focused, to keep my mind sharp even as the pace of the fishing slowed. Finally, I felt another subtle tap on the line, another delicate bite from a fish that was clearly being cautious. I paused, then set the hook. The rod bent under the weight, and the fight was on again. This fish was smaller, less aggressive, but it still required careful handling. I worked it back toward the kayak, aware that every catch counted as the challenge neared its final hours. With the fish in hand, I couldn't help but reflect on the day so far. The struggle for balance, between skill and gear, patience and action, was at the heart of this challenge. I knew that Mike was likely facing similar thoughts on the other side of the lake, both of us pushing our limits in different ways. The competition was fierce, but so too was the respect we had for each other's abilities. As I released the fish back into the water, I checked the time. The hours were slipping away, and the challenge was entering its final stretch. The next few casts could determine the outcome, and I knew I had to stay sharp, focused, and ready for anything. The balance had been found, but the real test was yet to come. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the challenge entered its final hour. The earlier excitement and intensity had given way to a quiet determination. Both Mike and I knew that the time to make our final casts was approaching, and each of us was focused on squeezing out one last fish that could tip the scales in our favor. The lake, which had been calm and still during the midday heat, was now coming back to life, with the occasional ripple on the surface hinting at fish beginning to stir as the day cooled. I had moved back to the cove where I'd started the day, hoping to capitalize on the shaded areas and the structure that had produced results earlier. The plastic worm had proven its worth throughout the challenge, but now I decided to switch to the spinnerbait once more, hoping to trigger a reaction strike from any bass that were beginning to feed again as the sun lowered. The spinnerbait's flash and vibration had been effective in the morning, and I was betting that it could work its magic again in these final moments. I cast toward the edge of a submerged log, letting the spinnerbait sink just enough before beginning a steady retrieve. The lure pulsed through the water, the blade spinning and flashing, imitating a fleeing baitfish. My heart raced with anticipation, knowing that this could be the last chance to land a fish before the challenge ended. The hours of concentration had taken their toll, and I could feel the strain in my arms and back, but I pushed through, focusing on each cast as if it were the only one that mattered. Suddenly, I felt a jolt on the line. A fish had struck the spinnerbait with force. I set the hook quickly, the rod bending sharply under the weight of the fish. This one felt solid, and I knew that it could be the catch that made the difference. The bass fought hard, making a run toward the deeper water, but I managed to keep it under control, reeling in with steady pressure. The reel's drag system wasn't as smooth as I would have liked, but it held, allowing me to play the fish without risking a break. The battle was intense, the fish making several powerful runs before finally tiring. When I brought it to the surface, I saw that it was a hefty largemouth, one of the biggest I'd hooked all day. The sense of relief and triumph was overwhelming as I carefully lifted the fish into the kayak. I knew this was a catch that could potentially turn the tide in my favor. I quickly unhooked the fish, placed it in the live well, and cast again, hoping for one more strike before the clock ran out. Meanwhile, on the other side of the lake, Mike was also feeling the pressure. He had moved back to the deeper section near the submerged rock pile where he'd had success earlier. His high-end gear had performed admirably throughout the day, allowing him to feel every subtle bite and fight fish with precision. But now, as the minutes ticked away, he knew he needed one last big catch to secure his lead. Mike had switched to a deep-diving crankbait, targeting bass that were holding close to the bottom. The crankbait's wobbling action and realistic pattern were designed to entice fish that were feeding on baitfish near the rocks. Mike cast with practiced precision, letting the crankbait dive deep before starting a slow, steady retrieve. He could feel the lure bouncing off the rocks, each vibration transmitted clearly through his sensitive rod. Just as he began to wonder if the fish had moved on, Mike felt a sharp strike. He reacted instantly, setting the hook and feeling the solid weight of a fish on the other end. This one felt different, heavier, more determined to escape. The bass made a powerful run, diving toward the bottom, but Mike's high-end reel allowed him to maintain control, adjusting the drag to let the fish tire itself out. The fight was intense, with the bass using every ounce of its strength to shake the hook. Mike played the fish carefully, reeling in only when he felt the bass begin to tire. The rod bent under the strain, but it was built to handle this kind of pressure, and Mike knew he had the advantage. When the bass finally surfaced, Mike could see that it was a sizable fish, one that could potentially seal his victory. He carefully lifted it into the boat, feeling a surge of satisfaction as he added it to his live well. With the clock ticking down, both of us knew it was time to head back to the boat ramp. The challenge was over, and now it was up to the weigh-in to determine the winner. I paddled back across the lake, my mind racing as I mentally calculated the weight of my catches. The final bass I'd caught felt significant, but I knew Mike had been landing some quality fish as well. It was going to be close, and the anticipation was palpable as I approached the dock. Mike was already there when I arrived, his gear neatly packed away and a confident smile on his face. We exchanged a few words, both of us knowing that the competition had been fierce but friendly. Tom, our judge for the day, was waiting for us with a scale and a notebook, ready to record the results. "Let's see what you boys have got," Tom said with a grin, clearly enjoying the moment. Mike went first, lifting each fish out of his live well and placing it on the scale. The bass were solid, with a couple of real bruisers that tipped the scale significantly. The combined weight was impressive, and I knew I had my work cut out for me. Tom recorded the numbers, his face revealing nothing as he moved on to my catches. My heart pounded as I lifted the first bass from the live well, placing it carefully on the scale. The weight was good, but I knew it would come down to the final fish. One by one, the bass were weighed, and with each one, the tension grew. Finally, it was time for the last fish, the big one I'd caught just before the clock ran out. I placed it on the scale, holding my breath as Tom recorded the weight. When all was said and done, the total weights were tallied, and the result was astonishingly close. The competition had been neck and neck, each of us bringing our best to the table. Tom looked at the numbers, then back at us, a slow smile spreading across his face. Well, gentlemen, I have to say this was one heck of a challenge, Tom began, drawing out the suspense. But in the end, the winner, by just a few ounces, is. He paused, letting the tension build for just a moment longer. Mike. Congratulations. Mike let out a whoop of victory, his grin widening as he shook my hand. I laughed, genuinely happy for him, but also proud of how close the contest had been. My budget setup had held its own against his premium gear, and the challenge had proven that it wasn't just about the equipment, it was about the angler. As we packed up our gear and shared stories of the day, the sense of camaraderie was strong. The competition had been tough, but it had also been a reminder of why we loved fishing in the first place. The joy of the catch, the thrill of the fight, and the satisfaction of a day well spent on the water. As we headed home, we all knew that this wouldn't be the last challenge. There were more lakes to fish, more strategies to test, and more stories to create. As the adrenaline from the weigh-in began to fade, Mike and I sat on the tailgate of his truck, sipping cold drinks and basking in the late afternoon sun. The lake, now shimmering in the golden light of early evening, had returned to its tranquil state, the excitement of the day slowly giving way to a sense of peace and reflection. The challenge was over, and though Mike had claimed the victory by a narrow margin, the real win was in the experience itself. We talked quietly about the day's events, each of us replaying the moments that had defined the challenge, the subtle bites that had almost gone unnoticed, the fierce battles with fish that had tested our skills, and the satisfaction of landing those final, crucial catches. There was a mutual respect between us, an understanding that both of our approaches, despite their differences, had been validated by the results. Man, that was close, Mike said, shaking his head with a smile. I didn't think it would come down to just a few ounces. You really gave me a run for my money out there. I chuckled, nodding in agreement. Yeah, I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out, especially with that last base you pulled in. But I have to say, I'm pretty proud of how well the $50 setup held up. It might not have the bells and whistles, but it got the job done. Mike took a long sip of his drink, then glanced over at my gear, still laid out neatly beside the truck. You know, I'm impressed. I've always been a big believer in investing in quality gear, but watching you work that setup today, it's clear that skill and knowledge play a huge role. You didn't have the sensitivity or the high-end components, but you made up for it with technique and strategy. It's a good reminder that sometimes, it's not about what you have, but how you use it. His words meant a lot, especially coming from someone who had always championed the advantages of high-end gear. The day's challenge had tested more than just our equipment, it had tested our ability to adapt, to read the water, and to make the most of every opportunity. In the end, it was those skills that had kept the competition so close. We both agreed that the results had taught us valuable lessons. For Mike, the challenge reinforced the idea that while premium gear offers undeniable advantages, it doesn't guarantee success. Even the best equipment requires an angler who knows how to use it effectively. The sensitivity of his rod and the precision of his reel had allowed him to detect subtle bites and fight fish with finesse, but it was his experience and understanding of the lake that had ultimately made the difference. For me, the challenge was a powerful reminder that fishing is about much more than just the tools you use. My $50 setup had forced me to focus on the fundamentals, reading the water, choosing the right lures, and adjusting my technique based on the conditions. It had been a humbling experience, one that showed me that even with basic equipment, it's possible to achieve great results. The satisfaction of landing fish with a budget rig was immense, and it validated my belief that anyone can enjoy fishing, regardless of how much they spend on gear. As the conversation continued, we found ourselves reflecting on the broader implications of the day's events. Fishing, at its core, is about connection to nature, to the water, and to the people you share the experience with. The challenge had brought us closer together, reinforcing the bonds of friendship that had been built over years of fishing trips, shared stories, and friendly competition. I think the best part of today, I said, was that it reminded me why I love fishing in the first place. It's not just about catching the biggest fish or having the best gear. It's about being out here, on the water, doing something you love. The thrill of the catch, the quiet moments between casts, the camaraderie, it all comes together to create something special. Mike nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that you need the best gear to succeed, but today proved that it's really about the experience. Whether you're using a $50 setup or a $500 rig, the joy of fishing is the same. It's about the challenge, the connection to the water, and the stories you take home at the end of the day. As we sat there, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, we couldn't help but smile at the thought of all the future fishing trips that awaited us. The day's challenge had been a blast, and it had sparked a renewed sense of excitement for the adventures to come. We both knew that there were more lakes to explore, more fish to catch, and more opportunities to test our skills, whether with budget gear or high-end setups. The challenge had also given us a new perspective on the gear we used. Mike, for all his love of premium equipment, had gained a newfound appreciation for the simplicity and effectiveness of budget setups. And I, despite my success with the $50 rig, had a deeper respect for the advantages that high-end gear could offer, especially in certain situations. It wasn't about choosing one over the other, it was about understanding how to make the most of whatever gear you had and recognizing that both approaches had their place. Before we packed up and headed home, Mike turned to me with a grin. You know, we should make this an annual thing. Every year, same lake, same challenge, $50 versus $500. What do you say? I laughed, nodding enthusiastically. I'm in. But next time, I might be the one with the $500 setup. We both laughed at the thought, the friendly rivalry already brewing for the next round. The challenge had been a success, not just in terms of the fish we'd caught, but in the lessons we'd learned and the memories we'd made. It was a reminder that fishing isn't just about the gear or the catch, it's about the experience, the connection, and the joy of being on the water. As we finally packed up our gear and prepared to leave, the sun dipped below the treetops, casting long shadows across the lake. The day was ending, but the excitement for future fishing trips was just beginning. We knew that no matter what gear we brought with us, the most important thing was the passion we shared for the sport, the thrill of the challenge, and the camaraderie that made every trip special. With a final handshake and a promise to do it all again next year, we headed home, already looking forward to the next adventure on the water. As I drove home from Lake Miller, the landscape bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, I found myself reflecting on the lessons learned from the day's challenge. The $50 versus $500 fishing contest had been more than just a test of gear, it had been a deep dive into the fundamentals of fishing, a reminder of why I fell in love with the sport in the first place, and a lesson in the importance of adaptability, patience, and perspective. The first lesson that stood out to me was the importance of adaptability. The day had presented a wide range of conditions, from the cool, misty morning when the fish were actively feeding near the surface, to the scorching midday heat that drove them into deeper, more sheltered waters. Throughout it all, I had to constantly adjust my strategy, switching between lures, tweaking my presentation, and even moving to different parts of the lake to find where the fish were hiding. My $50 setup had limitations, no doubt. The rod wasn't as sensitive, and the reel wasn't as smooth as Mike's high-end gear, but those constraints forced me to fish smarter, to pay closer attention to the water, and to think critically about how to get the most out of what I had. I found myself relying more on visual cues, watching the line for subtle movements, and focusing on casting accuracy to place my lures in just the right spots. This need to adapt made me a better angler, more aware, more patient, and more resourceful. Another key lesson was the value of patience. Fishing is often described as a waiting game, but the reality is that it's about knowing when to wait and when to act. During the challenge, there were long stretches of time when the fish simply weren't biting. The easy thing to do would have been to get frustrated or to give up on a spot after a few unproductive casts. But I had learned over the years that patience often pays off. Sometimes, the fish just need a little time, or a slight change in the presentation, to turn a lackluster session into a successful one. I remembered those tense moments during the midday lull when the bites were few and far between. It would have been easy to pack it in or to move constantly, hoping to stumble upon more active fish. But instead, I chose to stay calm, to focus on refining my technique, and to wait out the slow periods. When the fish did start biting again in the late afternoon, it felt like a reward for my persistence, a validation of the idea that patience is an integral part of fishing success. The challenge also taught me a lot about perspective, both in terms of the gear I was using and the way I approached the sport as a whole. Going into the day, I knew that Mike's $500 setup had some clear advantages over my $50 rig. His rod was more sensitive, his reel had a better drag system, and his line was less likely to break under pressure. But as the day unfolded, I realized that those advantages, while real, didn't guarantee success. Mike had to work just as hard as I did to land his fish. He had to read the water, make smart decisions, and adapt to the conditions. His gear helped, but it didn't do the work for him. This realization was empowering. It reminded me that while gear can enhance your fishing experience, it's the angler behind the rod that makes the difference. Whether you're using a budget setup or top-of-the-line equipment, the skills you bring to the table, your knowledge of the water, your ability to adapt, and your patience are what ultimately determine your success. The day's challenge reinforced my belief that fishing is a sport where skill and experience can often level the playing field, regardless of the gear you're using. The experience also gave me a new appreciation for simplicity. There's a certain satisfaction that comes from catching fish with basic, no-frills equipment. It strips fishing down to its core elements: the cast, the retrieve, the strike, and the fight. Without the distractions of high-end gear, I found myself more connected to the water and the fish. I was forced to engage with the environment on a deeper level, to really think about what I was doing and why. In many ways, it brought me back to the basics of fishing, reminding me of the joy that comes from mastering the fundamentals. As I continued my drive home, I thought about how the lessons from the day's challenge could be applied to future fishing trips. I realized that, moving forward, I wanted to strike a balance between the simplicity of budget gear and the advantages of high-end equipment. There's value in both approaches, and the key is to know when to use each one. Some days might call for the precision and sensitivity of a premium setup, especially when targeting finicky fish in challenging conditions. Other days, a simple, reliable rig might be all you need to have a successful and enjoyable day on the water. The challenge also reminded me of the importance of keeping an open mind. I had gone into the day with certain expectations, both about my own gear and about Mike's. But as the day unfolded, those expectations were challenged and, in some cases, turned on their head. Mike's high-end setup, for example, didn't always outperform my budget rig in the ways I expected. There were times when the fish were just as willing to strike at my simple plastic worm as they were at his premium crankbait. This realization reinforced the idea that fishing is full of surprises, and that success often comes from being open to new approaches and willing to adapt on the fly. Reflecting on the day's events, I also felt a renewed sense of gratitude for the sport of fishing itself. The challenge had been a reminder of why I love being out on the water, why I keep coming back to the same lakes, rivers, and streams, and why I continue to seek out new places to fish. It's not just about the fish you catch, or the gear you use, or even the competition. It's about the connection to nature, the thrill of the chase, and the peace that comes from spending time in the great outdoors. Finally, the challenge had strengthened the bond between Mike and me. We had always been good friends, but the shared experience of competing, learning, and reflecting on our day together had brought us closer. We had pushed each other, learned from each other, and celebrated each other's successes. It was a reminder that fishing is as much about the people you share it with as it is about the fish you catch. As I pulled into my driveway and unloaded my gear, I knew that the lessons I had learned that day would stay with me for a long time. The $50 versus $500 challenge had been an eye-opening experience, one that had deepened my appreciation for the sport and for the role that both skill and gear play in fishing. It had shown me that, regardless of the equipment you use, the most important thing is to get out on the water, to enjoy the process, and to keep learning, one cast at a time. The day had ended, but the lessons learned would guide me on many future fishing adventures. As I stored my gear and headed inside, I couldn't help but feel excited for what those adventures would bring. As I settled into my evening routine after the long day at Lake Miller, I couldn't shake the feeling of excitement for what the future held. The $50 versus $500 challenge had sparked something within me, a renewed enthusiasm for fishing, a deeper appreciation for the nuances of the sport, and a desire to push my limits even further. The lessons learned and the camaraderie shared with Mike had left me eager for the next adventure on the water. As I reflected on the day's events, my mind began to wander to the possibilities for future challenges. The success of our head-to-head contest had opened up a world of ideas. What other ways could we test our skills and our gear? What other lakes, rivers, and even coastal waters could we explore? The thought of new challenges, new environments, and new strategies filled me with a sense of anticipation that I hadn't felt in a long time. One idea that immediately came to mind was a multi-species challenge. Lake Miller had provided us with plenty of base action, but what if we broadened our horizons and targeted a variety of species? We could set a challenge where the goal wasn't just to catch the most fish or the heaviest fish, but to catch as many different species as possible. Trout, crappie, bluegill, catfish, each species would require a different approach, different lures, and different techniques. It would be a true test of versatility, pushing us to adapt to each new challenge as we moved from one spot to another. Another possibility was to explore different bodies of water. We had both spent countless hours on Lake Miller, and while it had been a reliable spot for our fishing adventures, there were so many other places we had yet to explore. Perhaps a river challenge, where we could test our skills in fast-moving waters, targeting trout or smallmouth bass. Or maybe a trip to the coast, where we could take on saltwater species like redfish, snook, or even try our hand at surf fishing. Each new location would bring its own set of challenges, from reading the tides and currents to understanding the behavior of completely different fish. The thought of a river challenge was particularly intriguing. Rivers, with their constantly changing conditions, presented a unique set of challenges that would test even the most experienced angler. The swift currents, deeper pools, and rocky shallows would require careful planning and a different approach than lake fishing. We could fish from kayaks, allowing us to navigate the water more effectively and reach spots that were otherwise inaccessible. The idea of drifting down a river, casting into eddies and undercut banks, and fighting fish in fast-moving water was exhilarating. It was a challenge that would push both of us to adapt to a new environment and refine our techniques. The idea of a coastal fishing challenge was also incredibly appealing. Neither Mike nor I had much experience with saltwater fishing, but that only added to the excitement. The ocean is a vast, unpredictable environment, home to species that we had never targeted before. We could head to the coast with our gear, ready to take on whatever the ocean threw at us. Surf fishing, in particular, held a certain allure. The idea of casting from the beach, feeling the power of the waves and the strength of the fish, was something that both excited and intimidated me. It would be a true test of our adaptability, our ability to learn quickly, and our willingness to step out of our comfort zones. There was also the idea of a fly fishing challenge. I had dabbled in fly fishing over the years, but it had never been my primary focus. Mike had even less experience with it, but that was part of what made the idea so intriguing. A fly fishing challenge would be a completely different experience from our usual outings, requiring precision casting, delicate presentations, and an understanding of insect hatches and fish behavior. It would be a steep learning curve, but it was a challenge I was eager to take on. We could head to a secluded mountain stream, surrounded by the tranquility of nature, and spend the day casting to rising trout. It would be a peaceful yet demanding challenge, one that required both patience and skill. As I considered these possibilities, I realized that the most exciting aspect of planning the next challenge was the sense of discovery that came with it. Each new challenge would require us to step outside our comfort zones, to learn new techniques, and to explore new waters. It wasn't just about the competition or the gear, it was about the adventure, the journey of becoming better anglers, and the shared experiences that would bring us closer together. I knew that Mike would be just as eager as I was to take on these new challenges. The day at Lake Miller had shown us both that there was so much more to fishing than just the equipment we used. It was about pushing ourselves, learning from each other, and embracing the unpredictability of the sport. Whether we were fishing with budget gear, high-end equipment, or something in between, the most important thing was that we were out there, on the water, doing what we loved. As I thought about the next steps, I decided that it was time to expand my own skill set. The $50 versus $500 challenge had reminded me of the value of simplicity, but it had also shown me the benefits of having a deeper understanding of my equipment and the environments in which I fished. I resolved to learn more about the different types of gear available, from fly rods to saltwater reels, and to experiment with new techniques that would make me a more versatile angler. I also realized that I wanted to share these experiences with others. The lessons learned from our challenge could benefit not just Mike and me, but anyone who shared our passion for fishing. I started to think about documenting our future challenges, writing about them, creating videos, and sharing our stories with the broader fishing community. There was something powerful about the idea of connecting with other anglers, sharing what we had learned, and encouraging others to take on their own challenges. The more I thought about it, the more excited I became. The next challenge was more than just another fishing trip. It was an opportunity to grow as an angler, to deepen my connection to the sport, and to share that journey with others. Whether we were targeting new species, exploring new waters, or learning new techniques, the possibilities were endless, and the adventure was just beginning. As I finally turned in for the night, my mind was already racing with ideas for our next outing. The day at Lake Miller had been unforgettable, but I knew that the best was yet to come. With a renewed sense of purpose and a wealth of new ideas, I felt ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. The water was calling, and I couldn't wait to answer. As I lay in bed that night, the house quiet and still, I couldn't stop thinking about the day's challenge and the future adventures it had inspired. The $50 versus $500 contest had been a test of skill, strategy, and perseverance, but it had also been a powerful reminder of the pure joy that fishing brings. Reflecting on the day, I realized that beyond the competition, the real value of the experience was in the connection it fostered, to nature, to the water, and to the people who share the journey. Fishing has always been more than just a hobby for me. It's a way of life, a passion that brings with it a sense of peace, excitement, and fulfillment. From the moment I first held a fishing rod as a child, I was hooked, not just by the thrill of catching fish, but by the entire experience. The early morning sunrises on the water, the quiet moments between casts, the feel of the breeze on my face, and the anticipation that comes with each tug on the line. These are the things that make fishing special, and they are the reasons I keep coming back, time and time again. The challenge at Lake Miller had been a microcosm of what fishing is all about. It wasn't just about who could catch the most fish or who had the best gear. It was about the process, the careful preparation, the patience required to wait out the slow periods, and the satisfaction of a well-executed plan coming together. Each fish caught was a small victory, but the real reward was in the journey itself. Throughout the day, I had experienced a wide range of emotions: excitement, frustration, determination, and ultimately, satisfaction. These emotions are part and parcel of fishing, and they are what make it such a deeply rewarding pursuit. There's something uniquely gratifying about the moment when a fish takes the bait, the rod bends, and the line tightens. It's a connection between angler and fish, a shared struggle that plays out in the stillness of the water. That moment, brief as it is, encapsulates the joy of fishing, the thrill of the catch, the connection to the natural world, and the sense of accomplishment that comes with it. But fishing is also about the moments in between the action. The quiet times, when the water is calm and the fish aren't biting, are just as important as the fights with big bass. These moments offer a chance to reflect, to take in the beauty of the surroundings, and to appreciate the simple pleasure of being outdoors. During the challenge, there were stretches of time when the fish were elusive, when all I could do was sit back and enjoy the serenity of the lake. These moments, far from being frustrating, were a reminder of the peace that fishing brings. It's a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life, to slow down and reconnect with nature. One of the things I love most about fishing is the sense of anticipation that comes with each trip. No 2 days on the water are ever the same, and that unpredictability is part of the appeal. You never know what the day will bring, whether you'll land the fish of a lifetime, discover a new favorite spot, or simply enjoy a peaceful day on the water with friends. Every trip is an adventure, and every cast holds the promise of something special. Fishing also has a way of bringing people together. The challenge at Lake Miller had strengthened my friendship with Mike, but more than that, it had reminded me of the camaraderie that fishing fosters. Whether you're fishing with lifelong friends, family, or even strangers, there's a bond that forms when you share the experience of being on the water. The conversations that flow between casts, the shared excitement of a big catch, and the mutual respect that comes from knowing you're both doing something you love. These are the things that make fishing such a social and enriching activity. As I thought about the day's events, I realized that the joy of fishing isn't just about the fish you catch. It's about the memories you create, the lessons you learn, and the connection to something greater than yourself. Fishing teaches patience, perseverance, and humility. It reminds you that success isn't always measured by the size of your catch, but by the experience itself. Whether you land a trophy fish or come home empty-handed, the time spent on the water is never wasted. I also found myself reflecting on the role that fishing plays in my life as a source of balance and perspective. In a world that often feels fast-paced and overwhelming, fishing offers a sanctuary, a place where I can slow down, clear my mind, and focus on the moment. It's a chance to disconnect from the noise and reconnect with what really matters, the simple joys of nature, the satisfaction of a well-placed cast, and the thrill of the unknown. The day at Lake Miller had been a perfect example of this balance. There were moments of intense focus, when every cast and every movement mattered, and there were moments of calm reflection, when I could simply enjoy the beauty of the lake and the quiet rhythm of the water. Both were equally important, and both contributed to the overall experience. The challenge had reminded me that fishing is as much about the journey as it is about the destination. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The $50 versus $500 challenge had been a success in every way that mattered. It had tested my skills, pushed me to adapt, and strengthened my love for the sport. But more than that, it had reaffirmed the reasons why I fish, to connect with nature, to challenge myself, and to find joy in the simple pleasures of life. Looking forward, I knew that there would be many more fishing trips in my future, each one offering its own unique set of challenges and rewards. Whether I was fishing with budget gear, high-end equipment, or something in between, the most important thing was that I was out there, doing what I loved. The joy of fishing is timeless, and as long as there are fish to catch and waters to explore, I knew I would continue to find that joy, one cast at a time. As I finally closed my eyes, I could still hear the sound of the water, feel the tension in the line, and see the sun setting over the lake. The joy of fishing was alive and well, and I knew that it would always be a part of me, guiding me back to the water, to the adventure, and to the peace that only fishing can bring. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?